I'm really pleased to be here to talk with Ebony G. Patterson about her work, which I've admired for a long time, especially since I saw her exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem that looked at the stolen childhoods of Black children, especially Black boys. Ebony G. Patterson uses what she calls bling, inexpensive faux jewels, pearls, fabric details, and other artifacts in her elaborate tapestries. The colorful textured surfaces force viewers to confront our fascination with shiny objects, even though we know they're there to seduce us. As the media theorist Neil Postman said, just because you know you're being manipulated does not mean you're not being manipulated. Her work makes you think about beauty and seduction, real and imagined. She wants us to look past the bling and heavily adorned surfaces to see the people and bodies embedded in the image, just as she wants us to acknowledge how Black people and our bodies are disappeared in societies and cultures. In the gallery, the coffins in Invisible Presence, Bling Memories, are covered with fabric that reminds us of upholstery, wallpaper, and home. Tassels and other details seem to be making the dead person at home in their physical resting place. These heavily adorned boxes are antithetical to the sedate coffins used in most American funeral homes. In some beliefs, the idea of making the deceased soul happy prevents the person from lingering as a disgruntled spirit who might haunt or disturb the living. From that point of view, Jamaican dancehall bling funerals are more than just celebrations of a life on earth, but assurance of proper placement of the spirit in the afterlife. The coffins in the next room celebrate Jamaican dancehall funerals, a more egalitarian version of celebratory funerals that were previously reserved for the prominent and prosperous. Researchers like Vincent Brown have detailed the differences between white Western funeral practices and those descended from West African traditions, where most Black people came from in the Atlantic slave trade. Instead of solemn occasions driven by grief and sadness, Black funeral traditions throughout the African diaspora contain elements of celebration and lightness, like this New Orleans jazz funeral. Parallel to the way jazz funerals were appropriated into second-line parades, which are performed for no really good reason, but often associated with Mardi Gras, Jamaican dancehall bling funerals brought these elaborate celebrations to everyone. Another aspect of the work in the exhibition, the bandanas used in the 72 project piece, made me think of the Mexican Zapatistas. In 1994, when the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, became law in Mexico, the US and Canada, indigenous Mayans rebelled and wore ski masks and bandanas to make their revolution visible. NAFTA was considered to be terrible for indigenous people, the poor, and the working class in North America. Zapatistas are named after the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata and persist to this day, reaching out internationally to advocate for all oppressed people. Like the people in Ebony G. Patterson's bandana portraits, the masks made the Zapatistas visible in their invisibility. Attempts to silence them and make them disappear are subverted. The Of 72 project confronts the reality that 72 people were killed in one police and military incident in Jamaica, and their names were never formally released. This work, substituting each of the dead with an anonymous person, celebrates and commemorates those lives. Visibility and invisibility are recurring themes in Ebony G. Patterson's work, especially represented within lush garden environments, just as in this detail of a 2015 work in her Perez Museum exhibition. The vestiges of a person are visible among the flora. On the floor in the installed piece are a pair of shoes that remind us a person was there. The environments of gardens are less apparent in the works in this gallery than they are in earlier and most recent works, but the allusions to gardens through printed and appliqued floral patterns are always prominent. This piece, Bearing Witness 2017, says "See Me" within another floral composition. This evening, we will learn more about what Ebony Patterson wants us to see and why in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that very generous dialogue and examination around the work. So what do I want you to see? I want you to see people. I want you to think and see the environments that people those bodies also come from. I think it's also important for us to think about ourselves in relation to those people, and to also consider why it's important to acknowledge people, why it's important to make space or to create space for others, whether it's in our everyday.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So one thing that I was thinking about was the images where there's a body among the plants. They're so striking and kind of haunting. Mm-hmm. And your work, a lot of your work deals with death in different kinds of ways. But it made me think about the idea that probably not too long ago, encountering a body would not have been that uncommon.
No.
Yeah.
The bodies started popping up in the way that they had in my work after I had to deal with a very personal death of mine, which was my father. So the passing of my father, I think, shifted the work a lot. And on the day I buried my father, I also came across a murder scene in a working class community after taking home a number of relatives who had traveled with me to a rural part of Jamaica to bury my dad. And I tried to find out as much as I could about the scenarios or about anything that related to this crime scene that I had passed and who that person may have been. And of course, what happens so many times, because one, it's a working class person, there's often very little information, if any at all, about that activity or about that murder. And so I found that after the passing of my father and having to deal with this idea or the experience of dealing with personal death, but then also having to deal with a public death, and then having to share those memories that are both personal and public, that those two things were pushing up against each other. And then also to the fact that my work was always had this continued interest in looking at the way working class people used codes of dress as a way of creating space or making space for themselves and dealing with ideas around claiming power for themselves. It seemed also to like a kind of logical step to also examine how that happens through the funerary. But I think the first time I'd ever actually seen a dead body would have been when I was 5. And I remember that fairly recently, and it was with a family friend. We were parked. I was waiting for my father, who had hopped across the street to do something, and then we noticed that a crowd started to gather around what we used to, with a bus that was called an Encava bus, the brand Encava. And what had happened was a woman was coming off of the bus before the bus stopped, and she got pulled under the bus. And so this family friend hoisted me up on his shoulder so I could see what was happening. Of course, my father was incredibly upset when he found out that this is what we went to go and examine. Like, why would you do that? why you did that for? You know, like it's just recently, like I was thinking, like when was the first time I'd ever actually seen, you know, seen a dead body, but seen a dead body that had died violently, right? So that was really early on. And then I also have even though I never, there was a family member of my mother's brother. He was the eldest boy of the, he was the eldest boy, second child of 9. Although I'd never seen him at his funeral, the way he died was also violent. He died between 2 buses. He was crossing between 2 buses, and one bus, it seemed, ran back, and that he died between the buses, and he didn't have any identification on him. However, my mother knew it was him because of the way his clothing was described. So he was wearing brown shoes, brown socks, brown pants, and a brown shirt with a brown belt. He was known as being a very dapper dresser. And so as soon as she heard that, she knew it was her brother, and sure enough, unfortunately, it was him.
Wow. You can see that came from some really powerful experiences and memories. So one thing I want to ask you about in terms of that is one theme that's integral and runs through most of your work is that juxtaposition of life and death, life as represented by living plants and flowers, dead plants and flowers being alluded to. And, you know, aside from the obvious dichotomy and juxtaposition, what else do you want people to understand from that? What do you want us to think about when we look at those two things together?
Well, I'm interested in the possibility of people thinking about how beauty becomes, how beauty could be used as a tool, and how beauty could become, and how beauty is used as a tool of power by working class people. So for example, there's always this critique about poor people or working class people being overly invested in the material things. So the idea of spending lots of money on a name brand garment or accessory, but not being able to find the money to tend to the fundamentals, like books for school or the school fees or food. Why is it important, or why is there this engagement with the material or with materiality on and off the body, and what does that do? And so I'm trying to butt up that kind of conversation against how people use those tools as a way of like living through hardships, right, and creating a space that doesn't wait for their value to be dictated, but rather to dictate their value. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I may not be able to afford the real Fendi, but I'll get the knockoff. And in that flash moment, just in that moment of seeing it surface, I've convinced you that I have this thing, and then by extension, you see me because I have this thing, right? And so it creates this moment of illumination where you have to take notice of me. And so through the work, I find those kinds of engagements really interesting, and I'm hoping that when viewers then experience those conflicts or those kinds of butt-ups against the work, that when they have to experience then somebody in their day-to-day, that all of a sudden that person no longer becomes invisible. Like that person too becomes visible, that somehow the work has maybe on the off chance forced you to carve space.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that description of the expensive objects and what that represents. So I was thinking that in a way, it seems as if your work gives people permission to indulge and revel in objects that are obviously inexpensive and fake relative to the goods that they emulate, like fake jewels, but they have their own beauty and aesthetics. In your work, even though they are, quote, fake in the aesthetics of commerce,
Right.
they become valuable in this context. So what I'm wondering is the idea that people don't need real jewels and gold to have opulence and a kind of wealth, that you can make it out of?
I don't know if I wanna. I wouldn't say that I'm giving people permission to do anything.
Sure,
I'm
yeah.
acknowledging the way people are
Right.
doing it for themselves. And I think that, a lot of that, of course, happens because we live in a society that attributes importance to materials. So, like, you have these things, so it must mean that you have value. So, for example, I've always thought it was interesting that within a cultural context, so much of, say, for example, in this case in the U.S., it's cultural identity in terms of it's a huge exporter of popular culture, right? And where that culture kind of grows or comes from is from predominantly people of color. But then when we think about in the day-to-day or in the larger social structure, those people sit at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They're the least valued. They're the least valued. So then what does it mean for the people who give so much visibility in terms of a national sense in a global way, for those people then to be discredited in terms of their value simply because of what they look like? And then how that then plays out in terms of social structures and economic structures, right? And so I'm, through the work, it's not that I'm saying that this is we should that I'm allowing people to be indulgent, but rather to ask people, why do people need to indulge? Like, why is it that the value of a person has to be triggered by the performance of, like, having things, why am I not enough? Why does my value have to be assigned to things that I have? And where does that come from? And I think that until we begin to, challenge or ask questions about those kinds of social structures, then nothing will really shift. And what does it mean then to question and challenge? It's not enough to just, like, show up and scream. It's also like, what do we do in our day-to-day, in our engagements? How do we shift that in our, on an individual level, so that it begins to happen on a communal level, and then it, it kind of spreads.
Right. Okay.
Or grows, or
so-
whatever. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Or grows. Maybe spread isn't the right word, but grows.
Have you, so what would be an example of that? Like, what would you say to the people here about what they can do in their day-to-day lives to shift the perception that maintains these hierarchies? Where do you start to do that?
I think listening is really important. I think that sometimes it's really easy to be, it's really easy to dismiss something because, well, I haven't experienced that. Well, just because you haven't experienced that doesn't mean that my experience isn't valuable or valid. Nor does it make your experience not valid or valuable. It just means that I have a different perspective. I think that it's also really important to also understand that none of us are monolithic. And if none of us are monolithic, then it's important. The only way the only way to truly acknowledge that is to give pause. I think one of the greatest things in, or one of the biggest challenges that we all have to consider individually is like, what is our power and how do we share that power? And I don't think that's a, I think it's an I and an us thing, like, so we have to ask ourselves, like, how am I participating in this? And even as people who may look like the very same people, right? How am I also participating in that? How am I making space for other people in that? How am I acknowledging others that sit outside of my spectrum, whatever that may be?
Right, right. Have you, this is, I think, somewhat related to that tangentially. The people who of the 72, the people who were murdered in the incident by the police and the military, have you ever known personally or introduced their relatives to your work?
No.
No. Okay.
So first of all, when I made that work, it was between 2011 and 2010. And in 2000, I think it was 5 years after the incident, so 2015, there was a public inquiry that had happened, and very little had come out of that inquiry even over the course of the 5 years in relation to those people. I made the work because I felt like it was important to mark the moment. I felt like it was important to, in some ways, I often see while my work seems to have an underpinning that relates to activism, I would never consider myself an activist or an artivist, which is another fashionable word. I consider myself a person who is, in many ways, almost like a history painter. Like, what does it mean to make something so that in 20, 30 years from now, when I'm no longer here and there are these seeds left, what does it say about the moment that I was making in? And also too, how could I not make something? It would have been so easy not to. Right. At the time when the incursion had happened also too, I was home. It was also the summer, the same summer when my father had fallen ill. When the incident had happened, it was also the same year my dad had died at the end of the year. But I always remember the phone calls that would play out on local talk shows, people calling in desperately asking for the Prime Minister to intervene. And largely the people who were always calling in, they were always women. When we'd see images of people protesting in the streets over the incident that had happened, which were not very many people. There were also women. And it's always interesting, and that to me is also really interesting. So the idea that men die, women cry, the fact that we enter this world through the bodies of women, and then somehow the pain and all of that is held in the body of a woman and released again. But there was an activist who had been working really closely with members of the community, Lloyd D. Aguilar, who was actively trying to get compensation for these for members of the community who I would, follow on Facebook, because he had an active page just posting things, and every now and again I would talk to him about what was going on, and I followed the inquiry very closely, and that was also something that was really interesting to watch how it was unfolding. But there were lots of, I got the sense that the community and because the community has been exploited so much, in the sense that You know, like everybody was interested in the story, so everybody would come there for the story. But not, and what does it mean then to come and stand in front of a camera repeatedly and relive the scenario that had happened to you? Because, you know, like the people who passed were victims, but so were they. Right. You know, because they also have another kind of trauma. They also have not another kind of trauma. They have their own trauma that they had to deal with, and we're lucky enough to be able to share these stories with us. Right. And yeah, it felt like it was really important for me to like just make something.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I noticed when I was looking at all the panels is that each of the people, if their ears are exposed, it's as if they have earrings. There's some piece of ornament on their ears. And to me, that just seemed like such a caring detail. And tell me about that.
Well, I think that work also came at a time when I was like shifting gears between like this earlier body of work that it was examining ideas around masculinity and kind of raising questions about what masculinity meant and how that was being performed through a dance hall or popular cultural lens. Right. And so some of those ideas, I think, just carried forward. And I think also, too, another thing, the fact that the number that kept coming out in the local press about the number of people who had passed, it's believed, the number is actually believed to be twice the amount. Wow. But this was just a number that kept coming out in the first days of the incident and carried through until I think the inquiry. There were questions being raised about the numbers altogether, that it was believed it could have been more than 150 people. Wow. Because there was an unmarked grave of bodies that were never counted. Wow. So I was thinking, well, if it was 72 men and 1 woman, how do we then determine what that looks like? Yeah. And then also, too, there was a story that was also circulating about men dressing up as women who had come into the community to fight to defend Coke. So I thought these narratives about how gender also became flexible in these moments, and how that was also butting up against questions around stereotypes around what not just masculinity, but stereotypes in terms of the kinds of people that also existed in these communities. It's also part of the reason why I've used the bandana around the edges of the works. So when I think about the bandana, I'm taken back to westerns and the cowboy memorabilia, right. The bad boy. But the idea also too that the bad boy on some levels is also seen as like beautiful. If we think about like the character Pretty Boy Floyd, the idea that the word pretty is again associated with this hyper-masculine persona. And so I wanted to butt all of those things up. And then also too, to think again in relation, although the work with the coffins came much later. But I was very aware of the practice around bling funerals, which was still growing at the time, and only practiced primarily in working class communities. How beauty also became a way of like carving space out for people as they marched through public space, taking the bodies of their loved ones off to wherever the final resting place was.
So when they have these funerals, what is the process of making the coffin? How does that happen?
So typically what happens, they'll go to a funeral home, and there are lots of funeral, like say for example, there are lots of these working class communities that are in downtown Kingston, in the kind of commercial section of downtown Kingston, there are lots of funeral homes.
Right.
And it says also too a lot about the expectations, or not the expectations, but the expectations, and also to the social conditions or the volatility of those communities too. So there are funeral homes that are quite popular, that are in and around these neighborhoods, and there are funeral homes that have managed to, create a name for themselves in terms of the kinds of funerals that they make, right? A lot of these communities also too, they have dons, which are considered informal political figures, that do great things for the community and not so great things. I'll put it that way. You can read between all the lines. But these dons also too, when they get buried, they would have these like really lavish funerals that look a lot like a state funeral. And it makes, like if you think about like in terms of that kind of social hierarchy within the community, the don is always at the top, right? But to think that Miss Mary Jane, who's just like an ordinary person living in the community with no connection to what's happening at the top, in her community, is also having a similar funeral. Right. And that she also recognizes her own value, and that value is performed on her behalf by her loved ones, by the members of the community, so much so that it looks like a funeral that may have happened for somebody who was like the prime minister or some major government official. What does it mean then to use all of those trappings and to create or to mark a moment of presence, even in death, by somebody who would have been deemed invisible just because of their social rank, socioeconomically. And in some cases, some people actually plan their funerals. There was one interview that I had read by, I think it was Annie Paul, where she had interviewed, she'd spoken to this woman who every day she would go to a funeral home that was in her community or nearby her community, and she was paying down on the coffin that she wanted, right? So here it is, she's taken absolute control over the way her exit happens. She's not leaving it up to anyone else, which is also really beautiful. And then people, when they come to these funerals, they'll dress up like they're going to a party. So there's no real difference in terms of the attire that may look like somebody going to a club versus somebody who's first going to a church and then going to the graveyard. And it's all considered in relation to the deceased. Like, I'm getting this garment to honor this person. And the proximity of these people to the person who has died may vary. Maybe somebody who they knew the person really well, or was a loved one of somebody who they knew, so they're turning up to support somebody who was in close proximity to that person, or just because it was a person from the community. But no matter what, they're turning up and turning up.
I see. So can you explain the relationship between dance hall and this kind of bling funeral? We had a conversation about that.
Right. I mean, dance hall it's just Jamaican popular culture. I mean, I think the closest immediate thing I would connect it to is hip hop. So hip hop has its own, it's both, it's both music and it's culture. Right. And dance hall is very much the same. So, there's lingo, there is fashion, there are dances, dances, as in movement, not to be confused with dances which we call parties, that may happen in particular spaces. So yeah, I think that's the easiest way to round it up.
Yeah.
Is that those two things, they kind of look similar, but they come, it's grounded in a particular kind of cultural, it has a specific cultural grounding and geographical grounding.
So you had talked about, and you talked here about the ways that people want to appear, like the idea of masculinity, etc. And we had talked about this idea of luminosity, that people want to, there are ways that people become luminous. Can you talk about that, and how do you use that in your work?
I think, okay, so when I think luminosity, I think shine. I just realized I keep looking up at the ceiling. I'm sorry. I should be looking at you. But yeah, when I think luminosity, I think shine, and I think bling.
But what about luminosity that sort of comes from within, like that something is almost lit from inside? Yeah.
That somehow gets performed outside through. Okay. Well, okay. All right, I haven't had that one yet. Okay. Well, I think that luminosity, like that luminosity that you're talking about is recognized first by the individual, who recognizes also too that the way that they're being engaged, or being seen, is affected by wherever they may sit. And while they recognize their value internally, they understand that they also exist in a space, or they live in a world that determines that your value is not something that happens internally, unfortunately, but it happens externally. And so I think that's why there's kind of like this obsession on the surface, right? That's why there's so much attention or concern about like dress. That's why I think there's so much concern about how dress isn't something that necessarily happens on the body, but is of the body. So, like the practice, for example, of skin lightening is an act of illumination. As evasive, as grotesque, and as problematic as that is, it is that the act of erasure does create a moment of illuminosity, right? In the sense that if we live in a space that has determined that beauty is on the upper end of the scale. So the closer you are in shade to whiteness is the more beautiful, or whiteness or lightness is the more beautiful you are perceived, which is a kind of Eurocentric idea about beauty. Then what does it mean then for me understanding that, being on the lower spectrum of that, and recognizing that because of the shade of my skin, I no longer I will not have the kind of agency that I desire. So what does it mean then for me to actually erase myself into presence? So here I am, you see me, and you don't just see me because of what's on the body, you also see me because of what I've done of my body.
Yeah. Oh, so many things to think about. Well, let's switch gears here a little bit, and let's talk about the physical work itself. And you were telling me how you make you collage and make your own fabrics.
Kinda.
I know, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time in fabric shops,
Yeah.
looking at things, collecting things, and lots of times when I travel somewhere, I try to go to wherever there may be like fabrics or trimmings that I often take back to the studio, and then get used at some point. Sometimes it's immediately, sometimes it's many years later. And a lot of times, in terms of like how that all comes together, really comes through, like I was trained as a painter. So I think about all of these materials in relation to painting. In relation to, like color, thinking about color, contrast, texture, the push and pull of things. And I think it's like over time, understanding, like having this kind of material understanding that I'm still trying to find ways to complicate, that I continue to like push the material, not just inside, but also outside of the work.
Yeah. So there's a huge amount of labor that goes into making these, and what does that have to do with how you're thinking about it? I mean, it seems like the labor is an essential part of it. So can you talk a little bit about what that means to you as the artist in terms of making the work?
I mean, I love to work. Sometimes a little too much. And I've paid physically for it already. But there is, so one, it comes from that place. Like I'm really, I'm enjoying the possibilities of discovery in the studio, and all of the new things that I continue to learn from the same materials that I keep working with. But then at the same time, I think that it also comes from a place of, I hate to be chintzy, but love. I think that there has to be, I'm dealing with things or thinking about ideas that could go, just slighter shift. It could be unsettling and problematic. So I have to think about where I am in relation to that thing or to these subjects, and how can I make it in a way that communicates the very concerns that I have, that I think comes from a place of empathy. And so I think that then requires a lot of time. And time not just meaning I'm sitting and thinking, but making and digging from that. And sometimes making so much that that I figure out the mistakes in that, discard that, and figure out the right thing.
So how are you seeing your work evolving? Do you see things, you talked about how you might find a new material and figure out how to work with that. Like, do you ever look at your work and say, oh, I see where I started doing this? And, how does that happen?
I go back to things all the time. So I remember some years ago, like having a conversation with somebody. They were saying like, oh, like your series always seem to be so short. And I always say, well, like for me, it's never done, because it's not like I've never finished like a series of work. I always see it as a place that I can always go back to, because I'm still unpacking that language. I'm still finding ways to turn those problems on its head. And for me, the work is an evolution of that. For me, it's the same problem that I just keep spinning slowly around and trying to figure out new ways that I could resolve these ideas. So I would never, for example, I don't even talk about the 2007 work with those with the figures that were oh, it was all about skin bleaching and thinking about like dancehall. I like, given the evolution of the work, there's no way I talk about that work in the same way. So I'm also forced to re-examine those earlier ideas and to look at how current ideas have managed to stretch that language. Because that's the other thing also too, as an artist, is that while your material language is growing, your personal language is also growing. And sometimes those things grow at the same rate, and sometimes they don't. I remember, like not so long ago in an interview saying, I feel like at the time when I had started this work, I was doing those things, but I just didn't have the maturity of language to articulate it at that point. I was still figuring it out. And to be able to go back to that and reassess that and still feel like I can still pull on those earlier things continues to be really useful to me. So when I start, I always go back to where I like last stopped. What was the problem then, and did I resolve it? And how can we resolve it in the next one?
So how do you figure out scale? Like the bandana pieces are small, but they're mounted as a group and take up a space. And then some of your work is just monumental.
Yeah. I blame that on my teachers in undergrad, to be quite honest. I had a professor, Stanford Watson, who taught me in second year painting back home in Jamaica, who would always say to me, make 3 of everything, and it's been something that has continued. Now I'm not making 3 anymore, I'm making 73. And then I also did, in my undergraduate years also too, I also did installation, which totally opened up the possibilities for what that meant in terms of negotiating our work. But I've always made big things. Ever since my undergraduate years. So like my final year show in undergrad, I think the smallest painting I had was like a 6-footer, but the largest ones were like 10 feet by like 9.5 feet. But the scale of these works are always considered in relation to the ideas. I don't make big things just because I can. I don't necessarily believe that bigger is always better, but the question, I have to figure out, well, what's the problem I'm trying to solve, and what are the best ways to execute that problem? So if it needs to be 15 feet, does it make sense for it to be 15 feet if what I'm trying to do is create a moment of intimacy? And then what does big mean? Can big happen through multiplicity in the case of the 72 project or the coffins, or does it have to happen in a singular work like like the 2015 Dead Trees work that you had shown earlier? With the shoes at the bottom. So a lot of those decisions in terms of scale are just motivated by the ideas or the needs of the work.
So you just mentioned the shoes, and one of the pieces, the description said that there were handmade shoes. Do you have shoes made, or do you use shoes that you find that are handmade?
Okay, so earlier in the practice, whenever you'd see shoes, those shoes were bought. And at the time, I used to use the shoes that the models would wear, and then I would embellish those and create a shrine at the base. But the shoes from that particular series, they were actually made. So for a long time, I really wanted to work with a cobbler. And that's such a, that's not a very popular tradition anymore. And especially, on an intimate scale as opposed to like mass production, you know what I mean? So I was really fortunate in around 2015, a family member of mine introduced me to a gentleman back home who was working as a cobbler. And we've been working on and off on a couple of things ever since. So, I buy my fabrics and then I go, Shuey. It goes by the name Shuey. and it's like, oh, I was thinking about this, and I think this would work really well. And that's one of the things that I love about being able to work with other people who have skill sets that I need. But I'm not able to do myself, or maybe not able to do as well, that I'm also learning from them, but then at the same time, they're also learning from me. So I'm like bringing fabrics, and he's like, no man, I don't think that's a man thing. It's always interesting to also, to be able to challenge his own expectations about what is possible, as much as he challenges me on those expectations. Yeah.